Well, you join me today at the wheel of my all-time favourite car, a very unusual car to drive, and a very rare car in this country. Yes, I'm driving a Accord A10 at last. Hello, welcome to Furious Driving, and today I am very excited because I am driving at last and for the first time my all-time absolute favourite car in the world ever. Yes, this is a Accord A10 from 1936. Now, you may or may not be familiar with these cars. They are something of a cult icon as cars go, but incredibly rare. They only made them for 2 years, and they produced, I think, 2,320 of both this and the 812 model, which had the supercharger on it. So seeing one here in the UK is a very, very rare occasion indeed. Now, these cars were the absolute embodiment of 30s style, the Art Deco, modern, futurist, streamlined look. And so with this really distinctive, daring styling, they forged the future of car design into the next decade and beyond. Now, looking at this bonnet, this is quite a distinctive thing. The car was nicknamed the Coffin Nose for good reason. This does look a lot like a coffin, obviously. Well, the Cord company was named after its creator, Erich Lobben Cord, or E.L. Cord as everyone knew him. And he was something of the Steve Jobs of the 30s. Now, like Jobs with Apple, although many of these ideas, it wasn't the first time they'd been seen, they did use them better and make more of them than anyone else had before. This car is front-wheel drive. It's not the first front-wheel drive in the world, of course. It's not even the first American front-wheel drive car, although that honour does go to another Cord, the L29 from 1929. It was also a short-lived car, which only ran until 1932. Now, front-wheel drive is very unusual for an American car and didn't really re-emerge until the 1960s. But as well as that, we also have, of course, pop-up headlights. Now, because of the 1930s technology not really allowing a small enough motor to live happily in the front wheel arch, you have manual window cranks on either end of the dashboard. Now, these pontoon-style front fenders were another piece of interesting design work because they're very, very streamlined, very aerodynamic in so much as they completely surround the wheel to improve airflow and disappear into like an aircraft-style tip, and instead of having running boards as so many other cars did at the time, making them look quite, well, dated now, this is completely open, more a fuselage body, again more aerodynamic, more streamlined, much more futuristic and modern looking for the 30s. The side exit exhausts of the 812 were an Auburn and Duesenberg design standard item. As well as front-wheel drive and retractable headlights and lack of running boards, other futuristic styling and aero features included hidden door hinges and a radiator hidden inside the bodywork rather than an exposed shell. It's all enclosed, and these big fins allow the air into the engine bay. Now, the bonnet is very long and rather heavy. Now, under here we've got the Lycoming L-Head V8. It was another fairly advanced item on this car. Built by Lycoming of Williamstown, Pennsylvania, in the 810, it was known as the FB engine. In the 812, with a Schwitzer Cummins supercharger driven at 6 times crank speed by the ring gear, on the cam, the FC. This is a 90-degree V8, and it uses a few little clever touches. It has roller bearings which push the very short push rods off to the side to actuate the valves, and the pistons themselves are dome-topped aluminium items, which means you get a better combustion chamber for a more efficient burn. And the main bearings apparently are removable shell type, as we are familiar with today. Instead of being cast type, would have been more common on cars of the day, although it does use cast bearings on the rods. It uses a 1-inch downdraft carburetor here at the top, and in non-supercharged form it makes 125 horsepower. With the supercharger attached, when it becomes the 812, it makes 190 horsepower. In the 1930s, this is big power. Now, looking into the front of the engine bay, this is where things become very, very unusual and quite interesting. This box of electronics down here, these are the electronic actuators for the gearbox, which is sitting down here in the front of the car. This is why this large bulbous area is here ahead of the radiator grille. So this is very technical, very advanced, very complicated, could potentially be the source of troubles for some owners. The car was ridiculously complicated for the 1930s. But yeah, this is where the gearbox lives on one of these. This is in a similar style to a modern Subaru, where the gearbox kind of hangs ahead of the engine somewhat, because the engine obviously comes as far as the radiator, and then sitting ahead of that is the gearbox and its selector mechanism. Up here by the windscreen, and the windscreen panels do actually open forward so that you can have some flowing breeze coming through the car, and electric wipers, which weren't necessarily a standard item on many cars back in the mid-30s. On the passenger side, because it's a left-hand drive American car, we've got access to top up fluids, And on the other side we have an air vent which can be opened from the inside. This can open with the windscreen open, but you can't open it if the bonnet is open because they will clash. Now the rear of the car is very, very sudden and steep. You can see where things like the PT Cruiser got their influence. There are a couple of different designs for this area of the car, but I think this one, the Westchester, which is actually also the Beverley, but the Beverley has a different interior, is the cleanest looking. There is a boot, a trunk, if you will, which opens up like this, very close to the bumper indeed. Then you have space for the spare tyre and whatever else you can cram around inside there with it. Here in the boot lid, the large round tail lights are faired into the panel rather than being separate sticking up items. Now climbing in is a tad unusual because we've got rear hinged suicide doors on this car. And the fairly sharply raked windscreen does mean that access for your head is a little bit tight. Now this interior is one of the most beautiful cabins I've ever seen or sat in. It is absolutely gorgeous. I don't know where to begin talking about it. Everything from the engine turned metal dashboard to the dials themselves and the beautiful red headlining. It's just extravagance and Art Deco in machine form. It's absolutely beautiful. Right, let's take you off the tripod and show you around. Honestly, where to begin in here? It's all just too much. It's sensory overload of just niceness. The door cards are lined in, I think it's called broadcloth. It's like a fairly hard wearing, furry type material. And this particular car also has the same fabric on these bench seats as well. The details of the door are absolutely gorgeous. And look at this huge chrome window winder. Just so much heft and weight to it. But the curves of it are just pure Art Deco style, with a mixture of repeating lines, swooping curves, long straights, and then heading up to the big main handle, which has got this repeating line motif again. Very, very Deco. We've got a little bit more detail of chrome up in the top of the door, and of course body colour window surrounds, because this is, you know, the period of time we're in. As I mentioned, we've got the headlamp winders, one either side of the car in order to retract and open the headlamps. So you have to turn this manually up and down to raise and lower the lights, you and your passenger, I guess. Now this, we don't think is a genuine original plaque. This certifies this Cord automobile has been driven at 110.8 miles per hour before shipment. We don't think they actually came with these, but a few of the cars do have them because the cars would do 110 miles an hour. This hides the little tiny glove box, which is quite small and narrow, ideal in fact for gloves. And I have to say, I do love this colour combination of the buttery cream colour with this dark plum. It looks absolutely fantastic. Now let's get onto this dashboard panel, which is one of the most elegant, beautiful and extravagant dashboards I think I've ever seen on any car. The engine turned metal is just beautiful. It puts you in mind of so many things from the 30s. Aircraft, but not just planes, airships as well, ocean liners, the futuristic movies of the day, all just kind of come into play here. Now we've got these incredible dials which are multi-layered, multi-toned. So we have the yellowy, it looks like it either glows or is glow in the dark centre part, surrounded by the actual dial instrumentation. The red needles, of course, also are quite striking, and they sit behind the outer bezel of with the number detail on it. This is speed in miles per hour, and again, check out that font. That is a lovely 1930s font, all block capitals and informative but jolly at the same time on that speed in miles per hour thing. Moving to the right of that, we have our rev counter, which you can't really see from the driver's seat because the steering wheel does block your view of it. But the little centre dial of these two middle dials look a bit like the targets on a fighter plane. You're almost looking down there to target things. This is the oil pressure, which is of course very important to any car to be monitoring, especially at this period when oil pumps and things weren't quite so reliable. Then we have the clock. The clock is wrong because car battery is disconnected whenever it's turned off. Then these big chrome dials, which are actually not anything to do with the running of the car. They are for opening these front vent lights. The windscreen opens forwards so you can have fresh air blowing through the cabin, which is rather pleasant. Now that sits above The radio volume and tuning are down here next to it. I don't think the radio actually works on this car, sadly, but the speaker with tone control is up here in the ceiling, which just looks like a nice bit of ornamentation between the sun visors, which are also quite nice to hold and touch, and also they do rotate around to the side, so if you want to block sideways sun you can do that. But yeah, it looks like it's just ornamentation, but in fact it is a working part of the car. Now, next to the radio we've got our amperes, our battery power level. If I flick the switch you should see things happen. We'll talk more about these running of the car controls in a moment. And down here to the right of it we have the fog lights. The car has got a pair of cord fog lamps down on the front bumper. Now these are very nice switches. They're again reminiscent of the controls in an aircraft. Instrument light brightness, the choke, which don't need that anymore, cars are quite warm, hand throttle so we can have a rudimentary cruise control, and the light switches. And finally to the left of that we've got two more things. We have a fuel gauge which doubles up as an oil level gauge at the push of that little button below it, and the last dial is of course the water temperature, which actually has a little thermometer in the middle of it. That's interesting and innovative, clever little way of doing things. And of course it's in Fahrenheit because it's a car from the 30s in America. Now on the steering column we've got a couple of other interesting controls. First of all we have our indicators, which I think are aftermarket, little kind of bullet style indicators just tacked onto the corners of the bumpers just so that people can see what's going on in modern traffic. But on the right hand side of that, far more exciting and potentially terrifying, is the semi-automatic gearbox. This is a pre-select electro-pneumatic mechanical gearbox. So you start the car in neutral, I'll talk you through this in a second. So our gears are just moved with this tiny little key-like lever here beside the steering wheel, so you can virtually do it with your fingers while you're driving the car and steering it. This is very clever, very interesting, and frankly terrifying the first time you drive one. Then lastly we do of course have the horn. Do you see the size of those horns inside the bonnet? Wow, that is a train horn basically. This is a terrifying thing for other people outside the car. Then below the dashboard we do have 3 pedals, because it is a pre-selector gearbox. You do still use the clutch pedal for making changes. Then with the handbrake down here to the left. Then finally, just looking around the car, we have these delightful bench seats with a pull-down armrest. And then looking into the back, just check out this headlining. This is just fantastic. And you'll see the back window isn't exactly huge, so reversing this car is kind of tricky, and seeing what's going on behind you is almost impossible. And these little lights in the corners, these courtesy lights, look like portholes on a ship virtually. Now the rear is the same interior fabric, obviously, as the front of the car. Nice big bench seat. Climb in, oh it's lovely and soft. You sink into these big bench seats very comfortably indeed. You've got obviously the matching as the front, beautiful Art Deco chrome door furniture, and there's no seat belts, but you do have a nice leather strap to hang on to, so if you're feeling that you're getting a bit thrown around in the back, you have the option to cling on here. Now, interesting, there's no actual door pull to pull the door closed. You have to use the door furniture or wind the window down and pull on the door frame to clunk it shut. And in the front we just have a nice leather armrest. Right, so starting the car is unusual in itself. First of all, power on over here, clutch down, triggers the starter motor. Take your foot off the clutch, okay? Foot on the clutch now because you're going to select a gear, move across into first, the window up so you get wind noise on the microphone, handbrake off, and then drive away initially in first gear like it's a regular car. There's no power steering. Brakes apparently are good for the 30s, but they're not sharp like a modern car, and the turning circle is dreadful. So I'm forced to make a right turn out of it because it won't make a left. So then we get ourselves onto the road, pre-select second gear, dip the clutch, hit the clonk, move to third gear, and then when you're ready, dip the clutch. There will be a noise from the front, you can't really hear as a passenger, but then the car's in third gear. The steering is very heavy. You can feel the weight of the early front. Let's move this down to second gear now. Now, through the corners you can feel the weight of the early front-wheel drive system. It's very, very heavy indeed. Now pulling up to a stop, clutch down, let it stop. Yeah, Autocar were very, very positive about these cars when they tested one back in the 30s, back 1936 I believe they tested one. They drove it at regular speeds of 80 to 85 miles an hour and thought it was incredibly good. They claimed to have taken it to 121, although it's quite a bit faster than the actual top speed of the car, so I guess we'll never know really how quickly they did take it. The engine has a lot of pull from this big old V8. This isn't the best road to be driving a car with a pre-select you're not familiar with, because there's lots of twists and turns and now cyclists, which I can't see past. Of course it's left-hand drive, so I can't really pull out too far to do anything about it. Design actually started a few years ahead of the actual launch of the thing in 1935. E.L. Cord owned a few car companies, well, three in fact. He owned Auburn, Duesenberg and Cord. He liked the nice, exciting, expensive stuff, didn't he? Now, in the early 30s, after the crash, the market for big luxury cars was somewhat diminished, and so he had been looking for a smaller, more cost-efficient baby Duesenberg, effectively. And this is where his chief stylist, Gordon Miller Burig, stepped in. It is a personal project almost, but he'd been doodling this car for a while.
And the prototype was built on an Auburn chassis in 1934. The project went on hold and Burig moved to Auburn and then back again. Their new management decided to rebrand it as a Cord and make it front-wheel drive, following in the style of the L29. Then the plan was dropped again and the design team was tasked with designing another car that they didn't seem to want to, and they appear to have done a deliberately bad job so it would be rejected, and the Cord was forced back on the table in the 11th hour to be ready for the autumn car shows in a matter of weeks and with zero budget.
But sometimes that change from second to third is so quiet you can't really hear it's happened.
It rides on trailing arm suspension, an all-new concept to try and keep the front wheels vertical. It's harder riding than you might expect, and a bit bouncy as cars of this period tended to be.
So you can't really hustle the gearbox, you have to take it at its own time. The 0 to 60 time would be much improved if it had a regular gearbox in the thing.
It doesn't get many pop culture references, but it was the car that Felix Leiter drove in the James Bond book Live and Let Die in 1982. To quote, "An old Cord, one of the few American cars with a personality, Bond approved." And apparently Bob Kane based the original Batmobile in 1936 on the coffin nose. So my biggest problem with this car is actually turning it around, because the turning circle is awful. The visibility is not that great. So when I come to do my 3-point turns to move the GoPros and just go back to where I've come from, it's actually quite tricky. It was an absolute hit and people loved it. The thing was though, it is not a cheap car. I said it was not a cheap car. The base price for one of these things was $1,995, $1,995 bucks. Let's go fourth gear. Which is about 5 times the cost of an equivalent size Ford or Chevy. So it was definitely a car for the rich amongst you. I just pulled over to let a van go by and he pulled in behind me, and I was thinking, oh my god, there's smoke or something coming out the back of the car, it's going to be a disaster. He'd actually been following me for a while because he wanted to look at the car, which is not something that happens to every vehicle I test drive. Right, so ignition on, clutch down to start the car. Now clutch down into first, because he'd drive away like a regular car for first gear. Make sure nothing's coming, there's a 4-wheel drive. And off we go. Moving through the gears in a weird, before you push the clutch way, it's very strange to do that and get used to it. Now one thing I was warned about on this car is that the oil pump for the gearbox is actually driven by one of the driving shafts, so the car only pumps oil around the gearbox when you've got your foot on the clutch or the car's actually driving. So if you leave the car idling with no one touching the pedals, it will potentially starve the gearbox of oil, which would be a bad thing. This is very much sensory overload of the best kind. I am having the best time ever driving this car. I am loving it. So yes, this has been amazing. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you have, please do like and subscribe as always, and I'll see you again next time driving something completely different.